A very good evening to our viewers. Thank you for joining us tonight on the agenda. My name is Toivo Jebela. Tonight on the platform we are joined by Rowland Brown. He is a local economist, also working and in fact having co-founded Cirrus Capital, a very important entity in our body politic and our economy. Rowland is here to help us unpack some of the manifestos that we've seen, especially those that on issues that speak to the economy of the country and everything else related thereto. Thank you, Rowland, for making time. It's been long since you came to the platform, but I hope you are surviving the silly season. I'm following your tweets and everything, and your formal contributions. Let's look first at this document that you authored some months ago, and Namibian Sun did a story out of it. It was actually a very, very good analysis, where you spoke about, for example, that liberation politics is no longer the key driving force behind voter behavior. What is?
Thanks a lot. Thanks for that question. I think, as you note, that comment specifically irritated quite a few people, which seems to be a strength of mine, is irritating people. And in fact, I think today we were actually supposed to have a debate on another topic
yes.
where I irritated someone, but the sparring partner hasn't appeared. Yes. But yeah, so I think this is a very interesting topic. And following the previous election, we, like many other people, I think, were quite taken by surprise in terms of the result in the 2019 election. And so after the fact, which isn't how we should do analysis, but after the fact, we started really looking into what drove that material change in 2019. And what we actually found from this was that the change had started a bit before that. The change was already quite visible in 2014. And while historically the SWAPO party and their presidential candidate had always been consistently in the mid sort of 70% of the vote, in the 2014 election, we saw this big upswing in support for both the party and the presidential candidate. And then in the subsequent election in 2019, we saw this big downswing in support. And this brought us to an interesting realization, which was that a certain portion of voters was voting along different lines to how voting had been taking place previously. And when we tried to disentangle that and get a better understanding of what was driving this change, the key thing that we found was that it's predominantly young voters, and it's young voters that are much less sort of loyal, let's say, to the incumbent party. I think many of the older people in the country, they really experienced the end of apartheid. They experienced the end of the sort of South African rule and control in Namibia, and they felt that step change in their lives at independence that came with that. But many of these younger people, while they've heard the stories and while they have some alliances and some sort of understanding of that situation, they don't feel it in exactly the same way as the older population. And they tend to be then less loyal to the incumbent party, and they are looking more at, where am I going to get the best possible results for myself to improve my lot in life and to take my life forward. And I think the lazy analysis on 2019 was that it was purely a fishrot story. There was certainly a fishrot component to it, but I think that there was a much bigger theme that was actually underpinning a lot of that. And basically pretty much from independence until 2014 or 2015, the material living conditions for Namibians had improved pretty dramatically. There's still obviously lots of issues, but you can see material living conditions have improved. And then in 2015, we saw this dramatic change. So now, after almost 10 years of very, very weak economic growth, we actually see a situation where GDP per capita now is back to the early 2000 levels. And with that decline in GDP per capita, obviously GDP is not split equally. We've got a very unequal society. And so some people's lives have been getting better, but a large number of people's lives have not been getting better. And so the result of this is that particularly this sort of non-loyalist group of voters are voting on, clearly voting on more economic material conditions than was the case in the past. And what's also very important to note here is that if you look at our population pyramid, so if you look at how the age groups of the country break down, we have a very, very young population. So there are many more people at the bottom of our population pyramid who are every year coming into the voter base. So in between two elections at the moment, we add something like 250 to 300,000 eligible voters. And if you consider in the 2019 election, we only saw about high 800,000 odd voters voting. So the number of new eligible voters coming in is a very big proportion of the total voter base. And I think that that's a far more relevant thing these days, the material conditions for young people, than is liberation era politics and credentials.
Absolutely. Yeah, speaking of the youth, your analysis also spoke about how the urban voters, young urban voters, are by far the most influential voter bloc in the country. And we have seen the NSA saying 71% of the country's population is now 71% of the country is young people. And we have seen also the ECN saying that 900,000 out of 1.4 million that have registered for vote for the November election are also young people. And we have seen internally in different political parties that young people are actually doing very well organically on their own. In PDM, the entire Central Committee now is very young people. SWAPO, for the first time at the Electoral College, we have seen young people making a breakthrough on their own. What are they telling us?
Well, I think they're telling us exactly what we said in that piece that irritated people so much, is that the young voter bloc really matters. And that young people are actually much more influential now in terms of the decisions that are being made. But I think that there's a lot of other things that one needs to read into that. One of them, which I think you can see bearing out in a lot of the manifestos, is that the world and economic policy and theory and so on have moved dramatically over the last 35 years. And yet, I think with a lot of the incumbent parties' sort of key personnel still being, either in the first cabinet or very close to it, you have a lot of very old, stale, archaic kind of ideas in that group. And I think while some of those policies and some of those positions served Namibia reasonably well for the first sort of 20, 25 years after independence, the last 10 years in Namibia have been pretty disastrous. And the point that I always make about this is that, we economists who talk about these things in sort of esoteric terms like GDP, it's easy for people to forget that behind that GDP number, there's a person that doesn't have food on the table because of an economy that's not growing, not creating jobs and so on. So there's a very real human element to these bad macro things that we see. Same with unemployment. I like to tell people that when we conduct polling, we basically filter for age, and then we ask a question, are you eligible to work, or are you looking to work? So we try to sort of get a proxy for the labor force. And then we say, are you full-time employed, part-time employed, or unemployed? And close to 60% of the population, once you've filtered out young people, once you've filtered out people that don't want to work, 60% of that pot that remains says that they are unemployed. So the statistics agency reports 33.4%, but the polling data, which is not completely comparable, but the polling data suggests it's much, much higher than that. And this is a human tragedy. This is a very, very serious situation.
Yeah. Unemployment, a lot of young graduates sitting at home. I was speaking to somebody on a similar platform, and there's this group of unemployed teachers who have organized themselves into a group of to agitate for their plight to be heard. And the specific guy who came to my show was saying that he graduated already in 2015.
Yeah.
Next year in 2025 it would have been 10 years. Unheard of.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what you think this kind of situation what kind of impact would it have on an election like this?
Well, it's very difficult to say. Namibia is a very surprisingly, I guess, in some sense, politically peaceful place. And I think that probably has something to do with the sort of informal sort of social safety networks that we have, the fact that we do have a culture of supporting people in need, whether it's directly or indirectly, the things like the social grants, the old age pensions, the wage bill is in effect a sort of redistributive mechanism that does see money getting out to people that are a little bit or are left behind. The same with communal land areas. I mean, these are also a sort of form of social safety net. And while, many years ago we did a lot of work on land tenure systems, one of the big pushbacks against looking at an improved land tenure system to allow people to borrow against land that's currently communal and similar was that, but then where do people go if they lose their jobs and so on. So I think that these sort of social safety systems, whether they're formal or informal, whether it's family and friends or the state, do keep things from becoming very from having a lot of political unrest and social unrest. But one can't think that can go on forever. Yeah. I mean, people can't live in these desperate situations forever without rising up in some form. Now, the conventional hope in a democracy, in a democratic system, is that if the system isn't working for you, you advocate for change. And that, theoretically is at least is a better system than burning cars and, creating those sorts of illustrations of discontent. But whether that actually translates into a change of vote is difficult to say. And we have so little data when it comes to what's going to happen in elections here before the elections. We, always interested in polling. When you go and you talk to most of the Namibian corporates and others about polling, they just think it's sort of somehow undermining of the state to go and try to figure out what people want to do before the election day. So we sit and wait, and then everyone's surprised after the election if there's an upset. But I would like to think that these young people whose lives are not really going in the direction that they would like them to go in are going to take some kind of political action and either demand of their existing party that there's a sort of change of course for the better and to improve the lives of younger people, or to look for alternatives. And one thing that we would certainly consider from the 2019 election is that was a warning shot. In many ways, that was a shot from the public to say, we don't like where things are going economically. And I will say, I think that the direction that the incumbent party's policies have taken subsequently have been a lot better. So between 2014, 15 and 2019, we were on a very disastrous policy trajectory. Since 2019, we've seen an introduction of, or around 2020, we've seen the introduction of a lot more technocrats into key positions, specifically finance, and then also the likes of NIPDB and similar. And I think that's swung the policy environment in a slightly better direction. But the problem is within the Namibian policy environment, you've always got this very slow sort of oil tanker type maneuvering, because you have an incumbent party that doesn't have very clear ideological alignment. So what I like to explain, particularly to foreigners who try to understand the Namibian political environment, is that one of the key things here is that the unifying force behind SWAPO was never really ideological in terms of an economic ideology. It was an ideology to bring about an end to South African rule over Namibian apartheid, which I think are obviously a non-purely or non-economic kind of nexus. As a result of that, you have a lot of different, very senior, very influential people within the party that don't necessarily have common ideology. So you've got some people that are very far left, and you've got some people that are sort of fairly central, fairly sort of mixed economy type thinkers. And there's been this sort of endless tussle back and forward between these two groups, which is good to create robust policy, I guess. But it also means that you can't really pivot in a strong direction very quickly. That's good if we're going to pivot in a bad direction, but it's less good if you're going to pivot in a good direction. So we always talk about policy drift in Namibia, that you don't really have policy direction, you have drift. And I would say that in the last 5 years, the drift has been favorable, but it's not really enough to fix many of the socioeconomic issues that plague the country. So we really need a lot more sort of radical change for the better, and that's not really very forthcoming.
Yeah, there was, I suppose the authors of that document, it's one of these rating agencies, I can't remember which one it was. They did something almost similar to what you did here, but theirs was more geared towards predicting the outcome of this election. And one thing that stood out for me was this prediction that, of course, the prediction is that SWAPO will retain the majority vote. They are predicting a very marginal win of 53%. Very conservative.
I wonder how they come to that conclusion.
Yeah, but the one thing that they fear is that if SWAPO doesn't win properly by a good number, they will panic and embark on radical interventions that could scare away investors. For example, they are saying in the mining industry, they might go in hard with nationalization agendas, and nobody would want to put their money into something like that. Is that your reading, or is it far from what you think?
It's definitely not what my view would be. I think this election will be close. The SWAPO people that I talk to on a regular basis tell me that they're confident of a 2/3 majority. I think that's very unlikely. I think that the presidential race may be even closer, but it's very difficult to say without a lot of data. The key thing to bear in mind here, though, is that they've been now basically, LPM is, let's call it, matured a little bit since the previous election. They were a very new, very young party in the previous election. And then we've added AR and added IPC as parties. So while it may be the case that these opposition parties are mainly eating from each other, I think that it's quite likely that they'll gain a share of the new voters. So there's 200,000 odd registered new voters. And I think that they may eat a little bit of SWAPO's cake as well. That's hard to say for sure, but certainly with the addition of these new parties, I think that you're going to see the cake getting spread out a little bit more. And given where SWAPO was in the last election, it may be that they're, where the rating agency suggests, but there is certainly a little bit of risk there as well. On the presidential side, the thing that we like to think about is, are the candidates for the parties more or less popular than their parties? And I would say in almost all instances, the candidates are actually bigger than the party, except PDM. I think PDM is going to be the big loser in this election. They won't like me for saying it, but I think that in just over a month, my statement will be proven correct. But in PDM, I think the party is a bit bigger than the candidate. But in the rest, the candidates are a bit bigger. So if you have a very close presidential election, then you sit in an interesting situation when it comes to a very close National Assembly election. Then you sit in an interesting situation with the presidential election, where you may actually end up in this runoff scenario. Now, I made that comment previously, and I got given a lot of grief for it. And amongst other things, apparently, I'm known in certain SWAPO circles as IPC boy for making that comment, which is just ridiculous, but it's funny. So no, I don't really see it that way. But let me give you a little tasty thought that we've been throwing around in the back of our minds as well. The real election to play for as far as a political party in Namibia is not this election, it's 2029. So 2029 is the election where the vast majority of the voters don't remember the pre-independence period, and it's just before oil revenues flow. So that's the election where there's a heck of a lot to play for. And so whoever is in power in this election, they need to make sure that they're doing what it takes to get the support and the votes required to have power in the 29 election. And if one assumes, as I think everyone does at the moment, that SWAPO will win the current election, then the big question is, what do they do over the next 5 years? But it doesn't matter whether it's SWAPO or someone else, just conceptually. What does that party do over the next 5 years in order to improve the material conditions of people such that they think that their lives are moving in the right direction and they continue to vote for that party in power? So that's a very, very interesting question. If this election is very close, and if SWAPO does stuff like nationalize mines and things like that, then the only way that you could retain control in 29 is if the election is not free and fair. Yeah. And I don't even want to go there. I think that, hopefully that's not something that will ever happen in Namibia.
Yeah. So the battering that SWAPO got in both 2019 and 2020, because in your analysis here, you are also pinning a lot of that. And I like the fact that you're saying that essentially we will be naive to pin the outcome of that election on Fish Road. alone or even largely. You spoke about some policy shifts that might have taken place since then, but in terms of the conditions on the ground, do you think there's been any radical shift really to now say, oh, the voters will now change their minds, or do you see things remaining the same and therefore the same tape might replay again?
Well, it depends to some extent what drove the change in the past. So one of our mutual friends believes that the key driver was perhaps a move against the previous president, that the previous president wasn't wildly popular by the start of his second term. Yeah. But that doesn't really bear out if you look at the 2020 election. So Geingob was no longer on the ballot effectively in that 2020 election in that sense. And so I'm a little bit skeptical of that assessment. My view remains that it's economic conditions that are primarily driving behavior. But there's two things that are very important here. So the one thing is whether your life is actually improving. That's key. But the other factor is, do you believe that your life will improve? You know, do you have a realistic expectation that tomorrow will be better than today? And I think a lot of, you mentioned this individual that's been unemployed for 10 years. I mean, you start to lose hope. I think those people that walk into jobs relatively quickly, they don't realize just how, not having a job now, not being able to provide for your family, not even maybe being able to have a conventional family and so on because you don't have any means, how debilitating that is, the damage it does to your morale, etc. And so I think the more relevant question at the moment is, do people believe that the promises of the various parties are going to improve their lives or not? I think if you just look at the numbers, we still have very, very high levels of unemployment. I don't think they've really started to come down yet. You can see huge household duress from the sort of middle class at the moment, the people that are borrowing from the commercial banks. We still have extremely high non-performing loans, meaning people are struggling to service their debt, etc. So the material living conditions have definitely not improved since 2019, really. We also went through COVID in the interim. So I would say probably since 2019, material conditions have got worse. The other thing to bear in mind there is that there's quite a big overlap between the eligible voter group and unemployed young people, new entrants into the labor force. So this change in the eligible voter base, which is this 250 to 300,000 people, correlates very strongly to young people entering the labor force. So I don't have the answer to this question because the Statistics Agency hasn't collected socioeconomic data properly for a long time. But a big question is, how many of these young people that are graduating are actually getting jobs? And I would argue that there's probably fewer people employed in Namibia today than in 2019. And there's many more people looking for jobs today than in 2019. Again, we don't have great data, but certainly the polling data that we have suggests that that's the case. So certainly the material living conditions of people hasn't improved dramatically. So the bigger question is, do they think it will improve? Yeah. And that's where things like the promise of oil, the promise of green hydrogen, these sorts of things become kind of relevant, and whether people believe those promises or not, and whether people believe that. Let's use oil as an example so that I don't get accused of being cynical. But if people believe that oil development will actually improve their lives, and that's where things like concerns around corruption, which also polls as a very high issue, or very high priority for people, is a big concern. If people believe that corruption will siphon off oil money before it gets to the public, that may influence voter behavior.
Yeah. The last question, Rowland, before we go for a short break, is and I know you have touched on it a little bit, but do you think people vote in all this research work that you guys do? Do you think that people vote in anticipation of what will happen in the future, or is it people being grateful for what has happened? Because if you look, for example, at the liberation rhetoric, that has been the biggest asset for SWAPO for the longest of times. It was out of gratefulness to say, look, these guys really brought us independence, they did this, and therefore we owe them this. Do you think that has shifted now, where people are saying, look, it's no longer about the past, now it's about what you're going to do for me in the future?
So in general, we don't have a very strong understanding of the key factors that drive voter behavior. Policy is surprisingly high up on the list of things when you poll people, but it's still only like 15-20%. Trustworthiness, whether they trust the individual, seems to be very important. Liberation credentials is very low. It's a very small factor. But what exactly the big thing is hard to say. You know, we joked in my office where I have a number of people that read these documents in detail and look at this stuff in detail, but we joked about the SWAPO manifesto launch. We said, does a music concert masquerading as a manifesto launch, does that attract votes? And the audience is very torn. So a lot of the cynical younger people go like, yeah, whatever. I don't really trust any politicians, so I'll just vote for the one that throws me the best parties. So I think that that's a cynical view. I think the majority of people are hopefully a bit more influenced by more material things. And obviously this is now the view of people that have that are employed and have incomes, and you know they can afford to joke about such things. Yeah. I would like to think that in general people do vote a little bit more on policy proposals and things like that, but it's very hard to say. Something that's interesting on the manifesto specifically is how much of their manifesto SWAPO spends on the past. So there's about more than 10% of the content is on the past, you know, where we've come from. And I think, you know, there you have to give credit where it's due. I mean, SWAPO has not done, especially for that first 20-25 years, did not do a bad job at all. It's just the last 10 years where things have really gone wrong. So the big question is, can they, you know, pull things back on track? If not, I think 2029, we don't. It won't really be a question in most people's minds. If things don't improve for the lay person in the next 5 years, I think 29 will be a big risk. Yeah,
we are going to get into the manifestos in a moment, but now a small break before we come back with Rowland Brown.
Neo Paints has established a 67-year Namibian legacy, creating personalized paint solutions that blend quality and innovation for the Namibian people. We pride ourselves in being a 100% Namibian-owned company, investing in our country and our people by employing and empowering true Namibians. With every brushstroke, Neo Paints commits to our quality guarantee and always delivering a coat of excellence. At Neo Paints, we always stay true to our country. We are as Namibian as you.
The conversation continues on the agenda with Rowland Brown. Now we want to go, Rowland, into these manifestos. You're a keen follower of policy proposals and interventions. What stood out for you in terms of, as a matter of fact, what is the best manifesto that you've seen so far?
Well, I think that there's one that just stands out head and shoulders above the rest, which is the IPC one. But I think before we go into that detail, I have to protect myself.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that it's important for me always to remind people that I'm not a politician.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm rarely accused of being a politician because I'm just far too blunt and I don't really know how to be subtle. But I'm very interested in policy, and there's a big difference between policy and politics.
Yes.
So policy is what I focus on when I look at the manifestos. I don't really care what colors are on there, even though that seems to be a sort of sacrilegious thing to say here. And I've always had this interest in policy. So very few people know this, but my first job was in the National Planning Commission here because I wanted to be involved in national policy.
You wanted to get Obed Kanye's job.
No, I don't think that was ever exactly my intention. But I actually turned down a job in the private sector, and the fellow who I turned it down from laughed at me because I wanted to go and work for government because of this. And then I worked at the central bank subsequently, also on the policy side, and then I worked on various different pieces of policy for government and for the country over the years. Yeah. And policy is very, very important for economic outcome. So again, looking at the manifestos, I have limited expertise on things like health and education and so on. I understand economics well and I understand economic policy well. So while I do have some understanding of those things, it's the economic side of things where I think the expertise actually lies. And that's fine at this point, because I think if you look at, again, if you look at polling information, when you ask people what their biggest concerns are and the issues that they believe government should be focusing its efforts on, in the top two, 70% of people, their top two issues has jobs and unemployment as one of the top two. And then things like housing, corruption, and health are the other the other three big ones. So many of those, a large chunk of those are economic issues. So jobs is really by far the biggest one. And given this, very, very high number of people who, self-identify as unemployed, I think that jobs is really where the big national focus needs to be going forward. And so it's very much through that lens that we look at these documents. And I think, as mentioned, just through that lens, looking at the IPC manifesto, it's absolutely head and shoulders above the rest.
Well, what are they proposing that sort of caught your attention?
Well, I think there's a few different things. I think one thing that one needs to bear in mind around the manifestos in general is that because SWAPO is an incumbent, they're held to a bit of a different standard than some of the others. So, a LPM or a PDM can talk about, whatever it is they want to talk about. We're going to change the country. I think in the PDM manifesto they say we're going to fix the economy. That's one of their promises. But when you look at the detail of what that means, there's nothing there. It's just fluff. And so then you sort of say, okay, but now on those manifestos you can maybe get away with that. On a SWAPO manifesto, if they were to say we're going to fix the economy, then people would ask, but what do you mean? And so when looking at these manifestos, I mean, the SWAPO one is not bad at all. There's definitely not lots of red lights there, anything like that. But there's nothing exciting. It's very much more of the same and so on. And it's at that level of a bit more pragmatism. So, not these crazy promises like satellites, as you mentioned, but more pragmatic things that can be done perhaps over time and so on. The IPC one, though, despite them potentially also being able to do all sorts of crazy, populist kind of promises, they don't do that. So that was the first thing that was very, very interesting. It's also very practical. It's not these pie-in-the-sky ideas, but there's a few kind of very interesting key things that stand out. It looks to me as if there's three focal areas. The first one is, so youth comes up again and again in LPM, IPC, and PDM. SWAPO also not to the same extent, but you can see those three parties really understand the fact that this big influential voter base is young people. And maybe I can take credit. Maybe they read my article, or maybe they just travel the country and see it themselves. But the bottom line is that they realize that this is an important group, and they seem to be targeting that group quite heavily. But then the IPC thing talks about job creation as a tip-top priority. That seems to be, really at the forefront. And that's absolutely the right focus, without a shadow of doubt. But they go into more detail than all of the others in terms of how you actually fix unemployment. So it's not just we're going to create jobs. PDM has a factory in every constituency as a commitment. Now, good luck creating a factory and private sector will do this apparently. It won't be a government thing. Good luck making a factory that's profitable and can keep its doors open in Bursaba or pick your rural constituency or pick your constituency. So the IPC one doesn't have just these broad promises. There's actually quite a lot of very specific stuff in terms of how to achieve jobs. And this is something that I find very interesting, because I think nationally we agree on the fact that there's a need to create jobs. In fact, you can see this through all the manifestos that there's a need to create jobs. The big question is, how do you create jobs, and why do we have this shortage of jobs? We have so many people that want to be employed, and we have so few job creators. And if you think about where jobs are created, they're either created in public sector, quasi-public sector, or private sector. In Namibia, our tax revenue to GDP is one of the highest in the world. So we have a government that has a lot of resources relative to the rest of many other economies, most other economies in the world. We're in the top 5 usually. And we deploy a huge portion of that. In fact, about half of that revenue, if I remember correctly, goes to creating jobs directly. So you can see that the scope for increasing job creation in public sector is very limited.
Yeah.
In SOEs, maybe a bit more can be done, but I don't think really very much. So that only really leaves you with private sector as a job creator.
Yeah.
So how do you encourage job creation in the private sector? You have to be sort of pro-business. Now, what I noticed in the IPC document is they talk a lot about entrepreneurship instead of business. That's very clever. Business has this capitalist negative. I'm not negative on capitalism. I think capitalism is a wonderful system that has improved millions and billions of people's lives. But it does have, as a friend of mine likes to say, sharp teeth. And you need regulators and so on to take those sharp teeth down so that it doesn't bite you. But to talk about business in a country where there is this sort of negative feeling towards capitalism and a capitalist system, and often a pretty weak understanding of what a capitalist system is, to talk about business is maybe a little bit dangerous. So talking about entrepreneurship is good. And entrepreneurship, I think, helps people mentally differentiate between these sort of big established corporates that many people don't have these very positive feelings towards, and foreign corporates towards local businesses. And that is completely the correct place to be focused on to create a lot of jobs, is to look at all of the issues that make it difficult for you to start a business, me to start a business, the very fine audiovisual team behind the camera to start their businesses, etc. And that focus on entrepreneurship and all of the little details that are in the document around how we're going to make entrepreneurship easier, that is very eye-opening. And I think that really was one of the big standouts there for me.
Yeah. I mean, we did some comparisons also, because we were lucky that both SWAPO and IPC launched their manifestos the same weekend. And I looked at the issue of taxes, for example, where IPC says that they will seek to reduce taxes a little bit in some aspects, including, for example, on small businesses that make profit under $2 million annually, I think. SWAPO, on the other hand, says they will be collecting taxes. The statement was a bit blunt in that sense. But we don't know whether they are saying now that they will maintain the levels of tax rates, or they will simply collect more from the pool that is available. What is the best way to deal with taxes?
So I think, again, maybe I must take credit for the IPC tax thing, because it's something that I've written about for 5 or more years. In fact, in your own newspaper more than once. And it's something that I've talked about as we have a very one-dimensional corporate tax system here. And I think all of us don't feel any real qualms about big established corporates paying a decent amount of tax. And especially, if you're extracting Namibian resources, you should pay the country a decent price for those resources. And that's maybe a debate for another day whether that happens. But for a big established entity, for a big bank, for a big mining company, we should have an aggressive tax rate that keeps the investors interested in being in Namibia, but maximizes what Namibia can get out. For a little company, for Toys Incorporated, that little company, when you first started, if you make 100,000 of profit in the first year, why should you give 32,000 or 31,000 now to the Ministry of Finance? The 31,000, government collects, they tens of billions. So that 30,000 means nothing to them. But that 30,000 means a huge amount to you as the little entrepreneur who's just getting started. Once you get a bit bigger, if you are making a bit of profit, you have 2 or 3 options. You can reinvest it into your business. You can pay it out, or you can pay it out to yourself. My argument on this has always been, if a business is taking funds that it makes and reinvesting it into a business, those funds can only be doing 1 or 2 things. It's building some infrastructure, that's good for the country. It's employing some people, that's good for the country. It's increasing its trade, that's good for the country. So if that money is staying in the business and causing the business to grow, leave it there or put a small tax on it. If the money comes out of the business so that you can buy the new Land Cruiser or whatever it is, tax it when it comes out. So tax it when it's your salary coming out. Tax it when it's a dividend coming out. But if a small business especially is keeping money in the business, then let that money stay there untaxed and allow that business to grow. And that's so fundamental to establishing industry in the country. It's so fundamental to ensuring that we have increased employment in the country and similar. And I think IPC has really jumped onto that idea. And that's, in my mind, an absolutely unquestionably the right thing to do. And it's very good for small Namibian businesses trying to get established and to create a few jobs and similar. The thing that I think people often don't fully grasp is those guys that make big profits, those big established companies, there's not many of them. You've got your few banks, your few mines, then you've got, it's like a pyramid shape. Then underneath that, you've got a few people that are a little bit smaller, that make a bit of profit. As you come down that pyramid, there's more and more and more businesses that employ 10 or 20 people that are struggling to stay afloat. Those small businesses, the easier you make it for them to survive, the more jobs are created. The vast majority of business ideas are not the billion-dollar business ideas. They're just basic businesses that will, a welding shop, a small bakery, these sorts of things. And so you need to make it as easy as possible for these businesses to exist, and then also as easy as possible for them to grow. And with those businesses growing, that's where you address your unemployment problems. That's where you address your future tax need problems, because then you have bigger businesses. And I like to liken it to a fruit tree. If you have a fruit tree and you plant that fruit tree and you demand from it every year that it must give you fruit, it's totally unrealistic. You need to let that tree establish. And once the tree is established, it will produce you oranges or whatever fruit it is for generations. But if you kill it before it's actually had a chance to establish, you will never get that fruit from it. And I think that that's something that's just so poorly understood within the current tax regime. I will say at the same time that I think the Ministry of Finance is slowly moving the tax regime in a better direction, but it's so slow and it's so incremental, and it's because of this resistance from, the other parts of, the other ideological parts of the party and so on that really slow that process of reform down. And so we don't see this radical change that's needed for us to catch up with the rest of the world on many of these things, to create employment, et cetera, et cetera. And it also, you can see it so clearly in businesses. How many post-independence Namibian success stories can you tell me of small businesses that were born in Namibia, that grew in Namibia, and are now yielding massive fruit? There's very, very few of them. Most of the businesses that you see in Namibia are old or foreign or small. Yeah.
What must happen to to all these resources? You spoke before the break about oil. I don't know what your attitude towards green nitrogen is. but all these are supposedly booming and looming industries, and I'm wondering how best can our country, actually benefit from something like that?
Yeah, so both oil and hydrogen, I think, are interesting to consider a little bit, but the Namibia's natural resources and how we maximize the use of our natural resources is a bigger topic in general. With hydrogen specifically, I think that the key thing is that it's very early on and it's very uncertain. There's still a lot of risk around it. So to put public funds in there is a bad idea, but that does not mean in any way that government should try to stop it or get in the way of it. We should still make it as easy as possible for private entities or for foreigners that want to fund it to do so. It will, if it comes off the ground, it will be an asset for Namibia, and so we shouldn't get in the way of it. On the oil and gas side, that's a very interesting one. So the Constitution is very clear on who these resources belong to, right? We don't need to look at subordinate legislation. The Constitution is what matters here, and it's very clear. These are Namibia's resources. Now, I like to tell the story of attending a meeting with some political people, and one of the individuals was getting very upset as I was talking about oil and the partnerships and so on, and eventually banged his hands on the table and he said, "It's our oil." So I said to him, "Yes, sir, but then why don't you go and get it?"
Yeah.
And there was this awkward silence, and the person that invited me to this meeting was very upset with me. And eventually the party in question calmed down, and he said, "We don't have the skills. We need partners."
Yeah.
And so I said, "Okay, well, let me recommend some good partners. Total, Shell, Galp, these are good partners. And so that's the basis on which we should be looking at these things. We don't have the technical expertise or the capital to develop these resources ourselves, but they do belong to us. So our position of negotiation is that we have these resources that you want. You've got the skills and capital to extract them. How do we get a fair deal? Yeah. And getting the fair deal is the tricky thing, because in the first round, when somebody comes and looks for oil, they're taking a huge amount of risk. Yeah. And they're spending billions to drill these wells. And they need to get a return on that risk, otherwise they don't get the capital given to them to take that risk. Yeah. So in the first round, with the first people that we issue extraction licenses to, we have to be willing to take a little bit of a worse deal. They've taken the risk, they've put down a lot of capital, and now they need to get a fair return for that. But now the situation's changing. Now Namibia is an extremely attractive place to invest in from an oil and gas perspective, and the risk is much lower. This allows us to negotiate a much more favorable deal for Namibia. We still don't have the expertise to take the oil out. We still don't have the capital to take it out, but it's much less risky for the investor, the external investor. And so we can now negotiate a much better deal with them in order to make sure that we get our fair share of that oil and gas. Now that doesn't mean we need to own it. One can legislate all the controls that you have from ownership very easily. It can be in the agreements with the oil and gas companies that you have sight of everything, et cetera, et cetera. So we can negotiate all of the benefits of ownership without all of the downsides of ownership. And this is something that I think it's almost like a sort of emotional thing, that because it belongs to us, we need to be in control of it. The reality is that if we're in control of many of these things, we're not actually able to extract it. So we need to give up some control. We need to maintain the control that we need to maintain in order to make sure that we get a fair deal. And that's just a negotiation. The principles in my mind are very, very clear. It's just the negotiation of what is a fair deal and how do we make sure that in each round of exploration and each round of extraction that Namibia gets a fair deal, and that the parties with the skills and capital also get a fair deal.
Yeah. Perhaps the final question to you, Rowland, and it's related to exactly this subject, is also how, because the downside of oil, as observed in other African countries, your Angolas, your Nigerias, has been that it became also a one-dimensional thing where all the focus is just on that, and to the extent that we forget about diversity and investing elsewhere. What kind of lessons can Namibia learn from what we are seeing across the world as far as oil is concerned?
So I think there's two or three types of oil outcome. So you have your failed state outcome. Unfortunately, that's more common on our continent than the success stories. Then you've got a sort of middle ground one, which I would say the Middle East is more of a middle ground. A lot of people celebrate the Middle Eastern success, but I think it comes at the cost of democracies and things like this, which I think certainly have some value. And I think it requires for that to work, it requires very, very, very strong leadership that identifies lots of diversification opportunities and fully backs them and pushes in that direction. And then you have the great success stories. The main one is Norway. Now, when we talk to most of the people that are involved in the oil and gas industry locally, so not the foreign experts, but the local teams, so at the banks, etc., at the law firms, they're all rushing off to Guyana to look at what's happened in Guyana. I always say that the only similarity that I see between Namibia and Guyana is that we have recent discoveries and we're small economies. Other than that, there's very few similarities. Namibia actually has a surprisingly large number of similarities with Norway. And Norway is the great success story here. And so what Norway got right is that they didn't receive these vast revenues and squander them and spend them. They invested them into sovereign wealth funds, and they didn't allow Dutch disease to take over, which drives up your exchange rate and makes all of your other export industries non-viable. They really sterilized the flow of these big oil revenues into the country. They were also they had relatively low levels of development. They were also primarily primary sector country, fishing and timber, prior to oil. We have a lot of these similarities, and the Norwegians that visit Namibia and that stay in Namibia point out to me often just how similar Lüderitz is to the small town where Skavania, I think it is, I can't pronounce it quite right, in Norway, where the oil was discovered, closest place to where the oil was discovered. And so I think we have got the potential to be in Norway. The key thing is to not allow these vast flows of oil money to come into the country and to be squandered.
Yeah.
Now, the big challenge around this is that we have a lot of things that we need to spend money on in Namibia. We have a lot of people that don't have jobs, we have a lot of housing issues, we have infrastructure issues. So we do need to use these resources in a sensible manner in order to improve people's lives today, not just park them somewhere, for future generations. So getting that balance right is going to be absolutely critical. If one does get that balance right, Namibia has the potential to be like Norway. And all of the signs at the moment are actually very positive. So the establishment of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, very good. If you look at where a lot of the guidance is coming from, it's from very sane, very sage people who understand these risks well. But the big thing is in execution and how one ensures that you don't have greed and similar takeover. And that's one thing where I would say these elections could be very interesting. We will definitely, in my mind, see a much more fragmented National Assembly. Whether there's an outright majority holder in the National Assembly, I'm not sure. But we will have a more fragmented National Assembly. And that's probably not a bad thing for accountability.
Yeah.
At the moment, up until now, we've had one real sort of center of power from a political party perspective, and a little bit more accountability that comes from having a more broken up National Assembly, different power positions that one can approach with concerns around corruption and these sorts of things. That can be very positive. And so I'm ever hopeful that we will move in the right direction. I think that the signs at the moment are positive, but it can change very quickly.
Absolutely. Rowland, thank you for coming through, man.
Thanks a lot for the invite.
Yeah, that's Rowland Brown. He's a local economist, one of the most brave ones, telling us, of course, sharing with us his views on a number of issues as they relate to the November 27 election. Thank you for watching.